going to be able to listen live. So welcome everybody to the Ranchers Thursday Lunchtime series as we continue to talk about navigating new guidelines as well as parasite management. I'm Dr. Rosalind Biggs. I'm an extension veterinarian housed within the College of Veterinary Medicine. Dr. Lallman, I'll let you introduce yourself.
David Lallman, Animal and Food Sciences. My work is in extension and research, primarily in the cow-calf segment. Appreciate you all taking the time to join us here this afternoon.
Absolutely. We're really privileged today to have Dr. Christine Navarre join us from Louisiana, where, believe it or not, it's hotter than it is in Oklahoma, and that's saying a lot for all our friends on the line. We were comparing heat indexes before we got started. So Dr. Navarre, I'm going to go ahead and read your intro if you want to pull up your slides, if that's all right. And Dr. Navarre received her veterinary degree from Louisiana State University in 1990. Following graduation, she was in private mixed practice in Sulphur Springs, Texas, before going to Texas A&M for a large animal internal medicine residency and master's degree. Dr. Navarre joined the food animal section at Auburn University College of Veterinary Medicine Teaching Hospital, where she spent 11 years providing clinical service and teaching of food animal medicine and surgery. She's currently an extension veterinarian with Louisiana State University Agricultural Center and Louisiana Beef Quality Assurance Coordinator. Dr. Navarre is past president of the American Association of Bovine Practitioners. And I'm going to throw in a couple other things because Dr. Navarre is a little bit too modest on her bio. She's also a winner of the AABP's Boehringer Ingelheim Excellence in Preventive Medicine Award for beef, and last year in 2023 was named the Louisiana Veterinarian of the Year. She and her family raise Sim Angus cattle, and her extended family is involved with the beef and farming industries as well. So Dr. Navarre, we're excited to have you today. We'll go ahead and put these slides in slideshow and get rolling.
Right. So is that, can you see it?
Would just throw it up into slideshow from there.
Okay, I'm showing on my monitor it is, but
okay.
Let's see. You may have to help me get out of slide sorter view. Display setting. Let's see what we got.
All right, then just change. Perfect. I think we're in good shape there. So
all right,
we'll take our videos off as panelists, and then we'll answer questions when you wrap up. So just a reminder for our audience, you're welcome to put those questions as we go along, either in the Q&A or the chat.
All right. Well, thanks everybody. It's an honor to be invited to participate in this lunch series. And yeah, it's hot and dry everywhere, and wishing everybody some cooler temps and some rain soon. So we're going to talk about parasite control in beef, cow, calf herds. Favorite subject of mine, and most of my experience is going to be, dealing with southern cattle, southern part of the U.S., but I get calls from all over the United States. So the things I'm going to cover today, if there are anybody listening that are in more northern states, hopefully you'll be able to get some things out of this too. So I'm going to ask you just a few questions to start out with, and this is always more fun in person, but first is, have you heard about parasite resistance to dewormers? I think probably most of you, that if you're taking the time out to listen in to this lunch series and do things like that, you're probably somebody who reads and tries to keep up. And so you've probably can answer yes to that question. The second two questions, really are related. Do you really want to avoid having parasite resistance problems on your ranch? I think probably everybody wants to do that, but I think it's a little bit more, it's not as easy to control parasites these days when you keep resistance in mind. So we're going to try to do our best to make that a little bit easier today. And do we want to have healthy cattle and a sustainable cattle business? I think everybody wants that. And if we can control parasites better, then we can get there. So again, hopefully I'm going to give you a little bit of background onto the resistance, just enough so that we can kind of dive into some refugia programs and some strategies to combat that resistance. So we know that the cattle dewormers are not working as well in the past. We have documented studies going back to 2004, but the problem is we don't have a lot of ruminant parasitologists that are doing really applied research, and there's not a lot of money to do that research. So we're not getting the information that we would like published as much. But again, this has been an interest of mine for a long time, and so I get to talk to people all over the country, and I've gotten documented cases of serious failures of dewormers from New York all the way to Washington State, Texas, all across the Gulf Coast, and several places in between. So it's not just a Gulf Coast problem, it's happening everywhere. And I can tell you that every time I go out and I look for resistance, I find it. I've not found a herd yet that I haven't diagnosed it, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. We know that this problem only gets worse over time. It's just a biological inevitability of using a product on parasites or bacteria. It all works the same. And unfortunately, we don't have any new products coming down the line. We don't have, new classes of products. So we have 3 classes currently. We've had those for a long time. There is a new product that combines 2 of those classes. We'll mention that a little bit later. But as far as a new product that these parasites have never seen that could be highly effective, we just don't have any hope that we're going to get one of those anytime soon. So we've got to keep what we have working. So impacts of parasites in general, I think we have to be a little bit careful with this, because there's studies out there that tell us, well, in this study, this happened. But what I want you to start thinking about is that this is really a ranch by ranch situation, and figuring out what is going on in your operation and how, making different changes in your strategies are going to help you is really what you want to think about. But we know that these parasites are going to really impact weight gains on young cattle. That's really the easiest to kind of put dollar figures to. We also know that it impacts reproductive efficiency, milk production. We know that they impair the immune system. And then in cases, normally they're subclinical, but in cases we can see clinical disease and death. And unfortunately, with the rise in resistance, when we have problems, and this year could be a bad year because we've got drought, we're going to be short on hay, we've got record heat, we've had record cold in the past. When you start really stressing those cattle and you've dewormed them and that dewormer didn't work, then we've had some really bad wrecks happen, and I want to keep you from having that, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And nutritional stress is really, really bad on these animals. So we, as a veterinarian, I went to school over 30 years ago and was taught that, parasites are bad and we should try to get rid of all of them. And then we turned around, and taught you that. And so for 40 years now, since ivermectin came out, we've been blasting these parasites and trying to get rid of all of them. And we are, that's coming to roost, those practices. And so we need to kind of switch our thinking around and not think of all worms as bad. And hopefully as we go through this, you'll kind of figure out where I'm coming from. So I kind of think of these as bad worms and good worms. So the bad worms are those resistant worms. So those resistant worms, when we show them a dewormer, they have genes that basically make them escape that deworming product. And when we deworm, we select for these bad parasites, and I'll explain that just with this figure in a minute. So then we have good worms, and it's hard to think about any worms as good, but the good worms are still susceptible to dewormers. And we call those worms, they're in refugia, and we call those refugia. And we want to keep some of these worms around to dilute out the bad worms. So this figure helps me kind of understand it, and hopefully it will help you. So if you look at this on the top left there, we have this parasite population within the herd. And it's almost football season, and I'm from the SEC, so we're going to throw a little football in here. So if you look at those kind of purplish worms, and I'm a born and bred LSU fan, LSU alum, so the good worms are going to be those purple worms, and those are the refugia. And those crimson worms are the bad Alabama worms, our huge rival. And so when ivermectin first came out, it was 99.9% effective, which meant that 0.1% of the population were already those Alabama bad worms. There weren't very many of them, but they were there. And as over years and years and years of deworming cattle, particularly when we deworm entire groups of cattle, we eliminate those good LSU worms, and all we have left that comes out of that are those Alabama worms. And when we have that kind of pure, population, then they breed to each other and they just spread. And over years and years, those build up. When we talk about refugia programs, we're not going to keep all of the refugia. We're going to keep some. We're going to still eliminate some of the good worms, but we want to keep a few of those around. So when we don't deworm everybody, we have some refugia left over, and that slows down. So we have some good worms in the breeding pool with the bad worms, and that slows down the resistance. And if we get really aggressive with that, there's a little bit of evidence that maybe we can reverse that. So a little bit more about the life cycle. So we start up there at the top. We've got the adult worms are in the gut of the cow. And so there's males and females, they mate, and then the females are going to lay eggs. Those are going to come out in the fecal pat. And as long as we have warm temperatures and moisture, those are going to hatch into larvae, and those larvae are going to come out of that fecal pat. And then they go through some maturation stages, and then they go over and they crawl up onto the grass, and they sit there in dewdrops, and they wait for cattle to come along and pick them up. And so that's that cycle. And for years and years, because we've had really effective dewormers, we've really only thought about the cow and those worms in the cow and how we eliminate those. But remember that when we're deworming, we're also impacting what happens on the pasture. And a couple of things I want to point out that we will talk about a little bit later when we talk about things we can do from a pasture management standpoint. The time it takes for the egg to hatch and go up onto that into that dewdrop is really temperature and moisture dependent. So when people talk about, well, if you just rotate pastures every 45 days and they give these kind of blanket recommendations, those work in a perfect world, but we know right now we're in a drought. So what's happening when we have a drought is cattle are continuing to deposit those eggs, and the larvae may actually hatch, but they're not coming out of that fecal pad. They're just sitting there and they're building up. And what can happen is when we finally get rain, all of those are going to come out at one time. And so it's really dangerous to really try to predict what's going to happen on the pasture. There's some things we can predict, but we'll talk a little bit more about rotational grazing later. But just keep that in mind, that time from what happens in the fecal pat to go into that infective larva can be anywhere from 2 weeks to several months. And then how long that infective larva lasts on the pasture is very temperature dependent. And one thing that we can do is if in the summer, if we take cattle off of a pasture, and so we've got fecal pats out there that have been deposited, as long as we get a rain and those eggs hatch and then move over to that larval stage, if there are no cattle out there to pick them up and they just sit there, they're going to die off very quickly in the summer. So sometimes we can use that if we need to really clean up a pasture. So we'll circle back to that a little bit later. So how many bad worms do you have on your particular ranch? How do you know that? So a lot of people say, well, I don't have any problem because I'm using my dewormers and they seem to be working. So the problem is if you look at the number of bad worms, remember I told you when ivermectin first came out, it was 99.9% effective. So if you look over there to the left of our curve, it starts out very, very low numbers of bad worms, so 0.1%. But over the years of using dewormers, it just gradually goes up. And then all of a sudden it goes up exponentially. And that's kind of like, you know, falling off of a cliff. And once it starts that upward trend, it's very difficult to stop it. But we need to still try. And the problem is we have two different levels. The diagnostics that we have, we're going to talk about the egg count reduction test that tells us if we have resistance or not and how bad it is. It doesn't really pick it up until it's in that exponential phase. So about 25% of the population of worms has to be bad worms before we can even find it with our testing. And then if we wait to have clinical signs of parasitism, then that's about 50%. So, you know, if you look at it, and going back to our football analogy, you know, by the time we see this clinically, you know, we haven't had any scouting reports at all that Alabama's going to win a national championship, and then, you know, there's no stopping them. We just show up and play them when we're not prepared. So what we want to do is do everything we can to keep from having that exponential growth and really falling off of that cliff. So a couple of things to think about though. So we're talking about resistance, but if you think your dewormers are not working, there's a couple other things we need to make sure are not happening. So we need to make sure that we have administered an adequate dose. And if we are just estimating the weight of cattle, especially adult cattle, even experienced cattlemen typically underestimate weight by about 100 pounds. So we need to make sure that we're actually given the correct dose. We need to make sure that if we're given oral dewormers, that they're actually getting as much of that as possible. We know that that's tough sometimes. And then we also need to make sure that the activity of the drug is not reduced. So making sure our products are in expiration date, but what I see more commonly is people are not storing the products properly. And so, you know, we all know if you buy, you know, the more doses you buy at a time, the cheaper it is per dose. So we buy enough that's going to, you know, keep us in stock for a long time, but we don't want to be storing those dewormers out by the chute. You know, we're supposed to hit 122, you know, today, and it's going to be crazy. So that's not where you want to store those dewormers. We want to store those dewormers inside, make sure they stay at room temperature. So we don't want to go off the cliff. And remember, our diagnostic tools don't even really tell us when we're getting close to the cliff. It's kind of like, you know, driving around with your at night with your headlights off. And so we need to get aggressive in trying to keep do what we can to find out where we are, but also not wait. If you have your dewormers are effective, you don't want to say, well, let's wait till they're not before we start doing, you know, something about that, because we're just a little bit limited in being able to find these problems in an appropriate amount of time. So we're going to think about moving from a deworming program to a parasite control program. And our goal is going to be to minimize those short-term economic losses and health problems. So we're still going to deworm cattle, but we're going to be selective on who we deworm and when, because we want to be sustainable in the long term. So we want to slow down resistance, maybe even reverse it. There's a little bit of research out there that says that, you know, that's possible. And then ultimately what I would like to see is we select cattle that are more resistant to the parasites on their own. So if I deworm an entire group of heifers, let's say, I am selecting them in the face of a dewormer. I'm not allowing them to separate themselves out and show me, okay, who's doing well without a dewormer and who may not be doing well out of a dewormer. And that's a long-term decision. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but that's ultimately where I think some places are choosing to go. And so we've got to give up our tried and true cookbook practices. Let's deworm in the spring and the fall and rotate products, which is no longer what we're recommending. And you know, I've never seen Frozen, but I think if you've been around, you know that song that comes from that, you know, let it go, let it go. We've got to be able to let go of some of those practices. It's easy to think about those. Those are easy. They're scheduled. We've done them. It takes more thought to put these refugia practices into place. But the good news is, in well-managed healthy herds, backing off on parasite control really is not gonna, you're probably not gonna even notice, because these are rarely deadly unless we really stress these cattle, you know, bad nutrition, things like that. And ignoring the problem is not going to make it go away. We know that it's continuing to get worse. And again, once you drive off that cliff, it's harder and scarier, and you have to get more aggressive. So it's time to really change what we do. So before we actually start talking about specifics, I want to make sure we think about that. We're talking about parasite control today, but really this has to be designed, your control program has to be designed in your management system and where you are located. You know, we rarely have a drought, so this year's a little bit different for us, but we are very high rainfall, warm temperatures most of the year. So that's going to be very different from somebody or some places that get less rainfall. Your management, your genetics, all of that is going to impact your parasites, and your parasites then impact your management. So you've got to talk to your veterinarian about your entire health program, your nutrition program, all of that when you're designing these programs. All right, so everybody's, you know, it's like, let's finish up with the background and get to what everybody wants, and that's and tell me what to do. That's what everybody wants. And it's not as easy as it used to be, but we're going to try to make it as simple as possible. So we have several things that impact parasites on your individual ranch. So we have pasture factors. Now, those are going to be hard to control. We'll talk a little bit about that. Cattle factors and the level of resistance, we have more control over that. So that's where we're going to spend the majority of our time. So pasture factor myths. So rotational grazing will control parasites. I think I showed you in that figure that when we talked about that, you know, that when those parasites are most, you know, the pasture is most effective is really weather dependent, and we can't control that, and it's very, very hard to predict. And so knowing when to rotate based on parasites is very, very difficult to predict. Freezing kills all parasites, so that's not true either. We know that it kills some of them, but a lot of those parasites burrow into the ground and then come back out when it warms up. Not grazing below 4 inches. So obviously, if you know you're really overgrazed and everything is low, that really impacts or increases your parasite risk. But cattle don't graze like lawnmowers. And so, you know, this picture is a couple of years ago at my place with ryegrass, and you can see, you know, I probably could have controlled this a little bit better with some more hot wire, but, you know, we've got ryegrass that's laying over, and I've got, you know, places where they've grazed down to the ground. So, so you're still, even if you have a lot of forage out there, they're still going to graze in areas, and they're still going to have some parasite pickup if they're out there on the pasture. So just kind of keep in mind, we would like to have hard and fast rules, but those usually get us in trouble. So again, climate, weather, pasture type, quality, topography, drainage, rotational grazing practices are all going to influence your pastures on maybe your parasite numbers on the pasture. Some of these we can't do anything about. Some we can, but they take planning, they take money, weather is constantly changing. So what I tell people is when you're starting out, don't try to control parasites by controlling pasture. you need to think about your pastures as how healthy are those pastures, long-term sustainability of those pastures, and providing nutrition for the cattle. Because if those cattle have good nutrition, then the impacts of our parasites are going to be minimized. So concentrate on your pastures, again, pasture health and cow nutrition, and concentrate on our animals to control the parasites. So what impacts the parasites in the animal? So young cattle going to be more susceptible. Bulls are more susceptible. Actually, this surprises a lot of people, but Brahman influenced cattle are, so a lot of people say, oh, they're parasite resistant, but that's actually external parasites. They are not necessarily more resistant to internal parasites. In fact, there's evidence that they are more susceptible to Ostratagia, which is one of our really bad parasites. So I'm going to have different plans usually for Brahman influenced herds versus English continental herds. Other stressors, liver flukes. We'll talk a little bit more about those later. And then again, you're going to hear me over and over talk about nutrition. When I see really bad parasite problems, I usually have a nutrition problem to go along with that. Previous exposure. So cattle have to have time and have some exposure to develop immunity. So if, we go up and buy a beautiful bull, in Montana, and he really hasn't seen a lot of our, parasites, he'll see some, but we bring them down here and they get really a big dose of them, then we can have problems. And we've seen that. We also know that the very southern tip of Texas and Florida, it's too hot to have Ostratagia. So cattle that are developed down there don't really have an immunity to Ostratagia. And when you move those cattle up further north, you can really see some problems. So we have to be careful of that. And then there's definitely some breed differences, but we also have individual susceptibility within cattle breeds, individual differences. And so finding those cattle is what we really would like to do. Now, we don't have good tools to do that specifically for parasites. So if, in sheep and goats, if you have anything to do with small ruminants and you're familiar with the FAMANCHA program, that is a beautiful genetic selection tool. We can look at those animals, and the pale ones we know have FAMANCHAs, and we can cull those animals. We don't really, because it's a subclinical problem usually in cattle, fecals don't really help us very much. And we don't have, there's no, genetic SNP test that I know of yet. Hopefully we'll get one of those. And so again, not deworming some of those animals and letting their true colors show up may be the only way. We can't say if an animal's thin that it's parasites or not, but we can say, well, she's not fitting in my, my environment and my management scheme. So maybe she needs to go if everybody else looks good. So we need to concentrate on young cattle, bulls, think about previous exposure. Over deworming really young nursing calves can backfire. Drought may delay exposure. So I'm a little bit worried about some calves that get weaned in the fall that have not seen parasites because we've been in a drought, and then we get some rain and we put them on some contaminated pastures. We really need to pay attention to that this year. Relocation, we can also buy resistant parasites. So talk a little bit about that at the end. Again, managing stressors in your young cattle, all the things that help the immune system, so that help us not have respiratory disease in our weaned calves. Really good preconditioning programs are going to help those calves fight the effects of parasites too. And then again, over time, trying to find cattle that do very well without dewormer help. So management of resistance, we need to properly use diagnosis and try to figure out what's exactly happening on your ranch, proper use of dewormers, and then develop a refugia program, which is going to tell us who to deworm, who to leave as a source of those good worms. So a little bit about diagnostics. So most of you are probably familiar with fecal egg counts. And so we're going to want to make sure that when you do fecals, that you're getting quantitative fecal egg counts. If you're getting a +1 or a +2, that is semi-quantitative or qualitative, and that really doesn't help you. You want an actual number in eggs per gram. Ideally, you want to take these from the rectum, but I can tell you that's not very practical in a lot of situations. And a lot of times I want those fecal numbers before I work cattle so I can make some decisions. And so fresh pasture grab samples are okay. They have to be really fresh. I tell people, give your kids or your grandkids a little extra money for each fecal they collect. And if they get a cow number to go along with that, have them sit out there and watch for cows to poop and go pick it up. Make sure that you talk to your lab, talk to your veterinarian about exactly how they want those collected and shipped. So you make sure that when they get to the lab, they're actually going to give you good results. So we get a fecal egg count number on a group of cattle, and what do we do with that number? Well, unfortunately, I can't tell you if I get one set of results from one ranch and I have no history of any other fecals. It's very difficult to interpret that number because so many factors influence that number. So there's really no, well, if it gets to this treatment threshold that works for everybody. So what we really want to do is start collecting fecals over time, multiple times a year in multiple groups of cattle. And so I have some history. So if I've been cranking along with low numbers, and all of a sudden they jump up, then I know that that means something because I have some data to compare it to on an individual operation, same cows, genetics, again, all of that. What they do tell us is that if there's zeros or mostly zeros, I probably don't need to put a dewormer in those cows. Now the only caveat is coming into the fall, type 2 ostrichiasis. We can see that in some cattle, and you might get a negative fecal, but that doesn't happen, and that's not real common. But you want to talk to your veterinarian about that. But most of the time, I've been out a couple of springs ago. I went out and collected a bunch of fecals as people were deworming. They were getting the cattle up anyway to deworm, and I just wanted to see where kind of a surveillance of fecals. And I stood and watched people deworm cows that we eventually figured out had 0 egg counts. Their body condition was good. They were on good grass, and they really had no reason to put a dewormer in those cows. Had we taken those, picked up some pasture samples before we processed those animals, we would have known that. And so I tell people, about 2 weeks before you're going to order your dewormer, your vaccine for your cattle processing, get some pasture scrap samples, make sure they're good samples, send those in and go, wow, if they're zeros, I probably don't need to deworm. If they're higher, then I have to, again, use my history to interpret those. So here's just an example schedule of, this is a spring calving herd, again, in the Southern Hemisphere of the US. In the summer, I really like monitoring fecals in nursing calves on those spring calving cows, especially in wet weather. Fall and winter, I'm going to monitor in heifers and cows. I'm going to check for flukes. So flukes are a growing problem in a lot of parts of the country. I know for sure. And talking to Dr. Meredith Jones, she's diagnosing flukes in some animals from places that have not really had flukes before. I've gotten calls from Illinois, Ohio, never had flukes before, and now I have flukes. So you definitely want to check for those. And especially we want to check if all of a sudden we've got a nutritional stress, really severe weather stresses. Those would be good times to really get some fecals. In the spring, we want to continue to monitor those heifers and cows. That's a good time to monitor our bulls. And then keep records of your weather, what groups are grazing where, body condition, because all of that over time, you start to build a picture that allows you, when you get a situation that's different, it gives you some evidence to make some better decisions. So we need to know if we have flukes or not. And then the species of nematodes, yeah, that's kind of nice to know, but don't always need to do that. Now, I had a weird situation. I've got a herd that has some really high counts in adult cows in the summer, which is very unusual for us. And so we're actually going to speciate those out, but that takes some extra testing. But normally I'm not going to worry about speciating those and figuring out which nematodes, because they're pretty predictable. And then one of the most important things we need to know is that level of dewormer resistance. And that's going to tell us, again, kind of where we are along, how close are we to that falling off that cliff. And we get that with the fecal egg count reduction test. Now, to get that, it requires that we're going to take fecals the day that we deworm, and then we're going to take a second set of fecals about 2 weeks later. It depends on the products you're using. But and the bad part is we need to take the fecals at the time of deworming and the follow-up fecals in the same animals, which is kind of a pain. But the good news is that's not going to change that number. Even if you institute a refugia program, that number's not going to change overnight. And so you don't have to do that every year. To do that, I would select weaning calves because they're the most likely to have high counts. You want to find animals that have high counts. Now, this year, that might be a little bit tough. And so again, if you're getting ready to wean calves, get some fecals beforehand, see what your counts are. And if they're high, then set yourself up to do that egg count reduction test. If they're low, then I might, wait till a different time, because it's probably not going to give you really good results. I like to do it on individual dewormers because I want to see where you are with each class. But from a practical standpoint, we're going to tell people to use combinations anyway. And so you can do it with that combination, a combination of classes. And when I get that, I want to see that combination gives me 99% efficacy. If it's less than that, then I need a more aggressive refugia program. So the dewormer classes that we've had for years, the benzimidazoles are going to be fenbendazole, albendazole, the avermectins and milbemycins. These are ivermectin, Dectomax, Sidectin, Eprinax, long range. They're basically all variations of the same thing. So you're not rotating if you change those up. And again, rotation is not what we want to do anyway. Levamisole is the third class. And then we have a new product that just got released by Zoetis called Valcor, and it is a combination of dormectin and levamisole. So again, it's not a new class. It's just a combination of two classes of products that we've had for a while. So proper use of dewormers. Why do we recommend a combination of dewormer? Because everybody's like, whoa, that's going to cost more. Yes, but remember, we're not going to deworm as many animals. So that's going to save us a little bit. And the reason that we do that, so if, let's say ivermectin is 80% effective, and so if I use that product alone, I'm going to have 20% of bad worms come out of that. And then let's say I have fenbendazole and it's 90% effective. And those are very common numbers that I get. And so 10% of the worms coming out of that from deworming everybody is going to be bad worms. If I use a combination, then usually you don't have resistance to two products, although that's happening more and more. Probably most of you, if you use fenbendazole, it's going to wipe out the ivermectin resistant bad worms and vice versa. So we end up with fewer bad worms coming out of that combination treatment. Not zero, but fewer. And fewer means that we're slowing that resistance down. Now, we still need to do that with the refugia program, because remember, ivermectin started out as 99.9% effective, but over years of not using refugia programs, we have, that doesn't work. And so what we don't want to do is build up Alabama worms that are resistant to multi-drugs, because that's gonna be bad. So we want to use products properly. I BQA coordinator for Louisiana, so I love things that don't require a needle, but I'm going to use the pour-on sparingly. We know that it's hard when you pour a group of cattle, they lick it off of each other, so the dosing is erratic. making sure we dose for the proper weight, avoid deworming and feed or mineral. I don't have any clue why my cows eat mineral some days and some days they don't. And so you're not going to get good dosing with that, which is just going to further lead to resistance. So it's very rare. There's a rare circumstances that I will use dewormers in a feed or mineral. It's really a rescue situation where I don't have any other choice. And then again, store products properly. So management of resistance, our refugia programs. I need to know if I have nematodes or flukes. I'm not going to talk about what we would do if you have flukes because it does change the program, but I'm happy to help anybody. My email will be up at the end, and you can always get that from Dr. Biggs. So we need to know that, but we're going to concentrate on what to do with nematodes only. So we have refugia-based strategies, selective non-treatment, which is we're going to leave a percentage of the group untreated. So I'm going to treat 90% and 10% are not going to be treated. And that percentage is usually between 10 to 30. Depends on my aggressiveness. It depends on, I really want to base it on my fecal egg count reduction test. Targeted selective treatment goes a little bit further where we're going to not treat particular groups of cattle. So maybe I'm not going to treat adult cows because they should be resistant, and I'm going to concentrate on calves, young females, and bulls. So beginner level, and it gets a little scary if you've been deworming to just say, oh, I'm not going to deworm adult cows. I do have producers that are doing that successfully. Again, their management is good. But if you don't want to go there yet, and this year might not be the year to do that, again, because our cattle are drought stressed, heat stressed. We're just going to not deworm 10% to 30% of our whatever animals we're getting up to work that you've normally dewormed. So again, start with 10% if you don't have your egg count reduction test yet, and then we can slide that if we need to once you get those results. So how do we know which ones to leave untreated? And the research will tell you if you don't treat the heaviest in the group, you're not going to even notice. And so that may be based on weights, that might be based on body condition score. You can either, if they're a very uniform group of calves, you can, you got 100 calves, don't deworm the first 10 and then deworm the rest of the group, skip every 10th animal. Lots of different ways to do that. So intermediate level would be stepping this up a little bit where we would have targeted selective treatment. Now, this is an example, and you really want to tailor it to the individual ranch. And again, if you haven't been doing a refugia program, this year, if you're having some stresses, this year might not be the time to jump into this. But I'm going to say, let's try not to deworm adult cows once they have weaned their first calf. Now, if I've got Brahman influenced cattle, later maturing, more susceptible to osteotagia, I might wait till they've weaned their second calf. If I want to really be hard on heifers and let them, show me that they can get bred on moderate nutrition, tough environment, no dewormer, then maybe I do that. I have a couple of producers doing that, but that's going to depend on your overall kind of genetic selection tools and what you're doing in your individual herd. Selective non-treatment. So I'm going to try not to deworm adult cows. I'm going to concentrate on young animals, heifers that I'm retaining. If I have calves that are leaving the property, so maybe my steers, then if they're going on a dry lot or non-permanent pasture, I'm not really worried about those animals building up bad parasites because they're all the calves are leaving and it's not a permanent pasture. I'm going to be able to clean those parasites up. If I have permanent pasture, then I'm going to want to at least not treat at least 10% of them. And because bulls are susceptible, we don't have too many bulls. I'm usually going to deworm my bulls, but I still like to check fecals on them to see what they're doing. Again, times of nutritional stress, poor nutrition, and osteotagia can really, really be a problem. And then as you develop this, then, doing some egg surveillance over time is going to allow you to refine your program and really pick up situations where things are out of the ordinary and maybe, wow, I've got flukes all of a sudden, or wow, my counts have jumped up. Maybe I do need to deworm these adult cows. And then we can start to think a little more about pasture management and movement of cattle. And then we want to have a biosecurity plan to prevent introduction of resistant parasites. So you can talk to your veterinarian about that. We don't want to overgraze. We can rest those pastures in the summer, again, when it's hot. We have to have rain at the beginning of the rest period, and clipping can help too, to kind of expose those parasites. Alternate land use for crop or hay production. We hear a lot about co-grazing with alternate species. There's just not. There was a good review of the literature last year at the animal science meeting, and I would tell you that I wouldn't go buy sheep or goats to control parasites in your cattle herd. I would buy sheep and goats if you're, trying to maximize the pounds of meat that you're selling on your system. And there is some sharing of some parasites. So you got to be a little bit careful about that. So finishing up here, I get the question all the time, wow, if I don't deworm these adult cows, or if I don't deworm 10%, what am I giving up? And really the studies are showing that if you're deworming really healthy, even young cattle, you're probably not getting as much out of that as you think you are. And I think if you've got enough animals doing your own on-farm trials can really be helpful. Deworm this group and don't deworm another group, and see what your difference is in your gains on your young cattle. There is one good study, I think, and you have to be careful. Again, I think extrapolating studies in other parts of the country on other ranches to yours, but in this one, they gave one set, everybody got dormectin, another set, everybody got aprenomectin or long range. And then in another group, 90% got aprenomectin. And after 112 of a grazing period, there was no significant differences between the treatment groups in weight gains, average daily gains, or a number of cases of BRD. Aprenomectin is a very long-acting product, so there was probably still some parasite control there. So, but I think if you at least try not deworming 10%, I don't think you're going to notice anything at all. So the bottom line, again, we want to still pay attention to short-term economics, track that on your own individual ranch, but start thinking about that long-term sustainability, selection of cattle that don't need deworming, that kind of survival of the fittest. And then I think if you're using a refugia program, that's a sustainable program. So I think, you can use that as a marketing tool. I think people would be, your customers would be really excited to hear that you're doing things like that. So I'm going to finish up there and open it up for any questions. I'm going to.
All right, as a reminder to our audience today, if you have questions, you're certainly welcome to put those either in the chat or the Q&A. We do have a couple of questions to start off with, Dr. Navarre. When trying to evaluate, diagnostics, any research or any information, have packed cell volumes on blood been used as a diagnostic indicator tool for cattle at all?
Only if we have Haemonchus contortus, which unfortunately is becoming more of a problem. So that one is really the only one that will cause significant anemia early. So we really don't have anything. I would love to have something like from on-chain cattle, but we just don't have anything good. You really can't look at these cattle and say, unless they get really bad and they're dying, that, if they're relatively healthy, we can't really tell. So I wish there was something better.
Obviously, we've been talking about large ruminants here, but we have a question on small ruminants. Okay. So maybe comment there. Yeah. What are your recommendations as far as combinations of dewormers for sheep and goats?
That is going to be totally based on your egg count reduction tests. I can get by in cattle, again, because it's not a deadly problem, guessing a little bit, but you can't guess in small ruminants because it's deadly. And this time of year is our peak time. And so you really have to do those tests to figure out what's working and what combinations are working. Because unfortunately, we're finding less and less that even combinations are working. And so selecting for those, you know, with FAMANCHA, which is really tough when you're trying to breed show animals. You know, if you're just trying to breed, you know, run-of-the-mill commercial animals that you want to keep alive, that's okay. But sometimes our show animals, they're gonna be susceptible to parasites no matter what we do, and dry lighting those animals is sometimes the only way to keep them alive.
Can you comment about, so we got a question in the chat about dung beetles, other manure insect species, on any impacts on internal parasites there?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert, an entomologist. You know, I do know that, you know, there's a lot of talk about this product, you know, being a problem with dung beetles. I think you got to look at all of your pesticide use on your operation. And so there may be some other factors besides deworming cattle that have more of an impact on that than others. Absolutely something, you know, anything that spreads out those manure pats can help, especially you spread them out. So if you want to drag pastures, and then again, if you get moisture and they hatch and there's no cattle in there, you can help, you know, you can do some things to clean up some pastures. So,
but it's got to be a combination really of activities on, again, not just one thing is going to clean those up.
Right.
So,
like, I don't know if you spray for armyworms, I really don't know. Does that have an impact on dung beetles? Somebody else in this audience might know, but you know, I think it's the entire system that we have to think about.
that would be a question for Dr. Talley, and I don't think he's on the line. I can't answer it. Maybe Dr. Lawman can, but I'll let you come back, Dr. Lawman, if you know that one. So what about other more all natural? I know that's a big discussion really across within the veterinary world, across a lot of different species. Do we have any other natural type anthelmintic plants, properties? You know, a big one that comes up, especially in small animals, is like diatomaceous earth. That's not one I'm particularly a fan of. So can you comment on those?
Yeah, unfortunately, there's nothing that has really risen to the top. Diatomaceous earth, study after study has shown no effect. Garlic, you know, for flies, I think we grow flies in the South too well. I have not had anybody tell me that they're real impressed with that for internal or external parasites. The only one that seems to have some effect is the fungi that comes out, and it actually lassos the larva so it can't come out of the fecal pad. The problem with that is it is very expensive. So for an adult small ruminant, it's about $1 a day. I have not even priced it for cattle because I think it would price itself out. And you have to feed it every day. And so I really don't like feeding cattle. I would rather them harvest grass. So there's some, you know, some practicalities to it too. That's really and bioworma is the commercial name for that. It comes on and off the market too. They seem to have a production problem with it. So that's the only one that really has shown anything, you know, kind of natural products.
Couple of questions, Dr. Lawman. I'm going to let you chime in there, it looks like.
Yeah, I'm famous for being muted, right? Dr. Navarre, what about high tannin plants?
Yeah, so the problem with those is the Serratia lespedeza that's been studied is cattle don't like it. So there's a palatability problem. You kind of have to teach, and most of the work's been done on small ruminants. I'm not aware of a whole lot on cattle, but they don't like it. So you got to teach them to eat it. And right now, I don't think you can even get the seed. So, and I'm not aware of any other really high tannin products. Not all tannins work. So you got to be really careful, and tannins, high tannin plants can be toxic. So you're kind of walking a fine line there, and you really want to use a product that has had research behind it and that has been shown to be non-toxic. So again, it's not going to deworm the animals. What it does is it decreases the fecal output of the survivability of the worms. And so it's a kind of a way to clean up the pastures.
Dr. Navarre, let's talk a little bit about fecal egg counts and the consistency of those. We've got a question in the chat as far as throughout the day, for instance, within a 24-hour period, we see consistent fecal egg counts. If I were to collect sample, is there any advantage to collecting at 8 o'clock in the morning versus 5 o'clock in the evening, or only do it under the cover of darkness? What does that look like?
Yeah, I'd have to go back and look at that. I'm not aware of a lot of differences in time of day. I can tell you that the diet they're on impacts them, their immune system. A lot of things factor in the amount of fecal water they have. So if they're on ryegrass and it's really watery, that might not be a time to get fecals. So there's so many things that factor into that number. That's why having those results over several time periods kind of gives you a baseline, and you can kind of average that out to see where you actually are. And then when I get one thing, I have something to compare it to, because there are just so many things that impact that fecal egg count that it just doesn't, it's all we have. But we really have to be careful how we interpret those. And again, you want to make sure your lab is giving you eggs per gram. And really the mini flow tac has been shown to be the best technique to use on that. And actually you can use the mini flow tac to find flukes. You have to do a different solution, but I just learned that. So.
Well, and we will put a plug in for our Oklahoma Animal Disease Diagnostic Laboratory.
Yes.
They do offer fecal egg count reduction tests. And I think Dr. Gillum next week will talk about some of his recently published literature on that, on his research, and maybe a cost savings opportunity there with composite samples. So we'll leave that for Dr. Gillum for next week. We're getting pretty darn close to 1 o'clock, so I think we'll wrap up. As we mentioned last week, thanks so much, Dr. Navarre. We talked last week about pharmaceutical stewardship, and those changes hit on a lot of those points really today, as well, as far as establishing a relationship with our veterinarian, biosecurity, and making sure we're taking care of the products we have on the shelf and hopefully have them available as long as possible. We do have ongoing research, Dr. Lallman, Dr. Beck, myself, as well as Dr. Gillum. So if you are interested in maybe getting some of the fecal egg count reduction tests done free of charge, we do have that research project, and CABE has been kind enough to put that link in the chat for anyone online. It will just apply to our Oklahoma producers, but it can apply to multiple classes of cattle. So that is an opportunity if you're looking for that. As a reminder too, we've recorded today. Our sessions are always recorded, and so if you're looking for any of those archived webinars, you can find that link's in the chat, but beef.okstate.edu. So thanks, Dr. Navarre, for joining us. Any last comments, Dr. Lallman? What have I forgotten? You're muted again, Dr. Lallman.
I'll just say thank you also, Dr. Navarre. Outstanding presentation. A lot of really good practical information. Thank you.
Good. And we are actually trying to validate that we can do fecal egg count reduction test on pasture grab samples. The parasitologists don't like to hear that, but it's going to be so much more practical if we can do that. So stay tuned.
Stay tuned. We'll have to have you back once we know the answers there. So thanks, Dr. Navarre. I hope it gets a little bit cooler for everyone.
Yeah, same to y'all.
Whether we're in Louisiana, and the bad worms are always the Alabama worms. So
that's right.
we don't like red and white worms either here.
Crimson's for OU around here, though.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
I should have used OU, but yeah.
That's right. Well,
Alabama's
hey,
pretty universally the bad worms.
that's true. That's true.
Yeah.
So with that, we'll wrap up today,
Right.
and thank everyone for joining. We'll see you hopefully next week, where Dr. John Gillum will be visiting with us a little bit more about some recent research right here out of Oklahoma State, and talking a little bit more about parasite resistance. So with that, we will sign off, and hope you'll be able to join us next week.
Bye, everybody.